Sometimes catastrophe hides in plain sight, not in fire or storm, but in a single digit typed wrong. Complex machines like airliners live and die on precision, yet one slip of a finger can undo every safeguard. On this night, every check meant to catch that error failed, and the systems built to protect looked away. Suddenly, 275 lives were riding on numbers that didn't add up. Would this aircraft rise smoothly into the night sky, or end as the deadliest crash in Australian history? This is the story of Emirates Flight 407, a story not just about metal and machines, but about how one overlooked detail can push human judgment to its limit. And it began on a clear Friday evening in March 2009. It was 10:30 p.m. on Friday, March 20th, 2009. Melbourne Airport lay under a still, late summer sky. The weather was perfect for flying. Clear visibility, light winds, nothing to hint at danger. Runway 16 stretched out 3,657 meters of asphalt, long enough to handle the heaviest aircraft in the world. On this night, it was waiting for Emirates Flight 407. The airplane was an Airbus A340-500, tail number A6ERG. At just 5 years old, it was a workhorse designed for the longest flights across oceans. It had carried thousands of passengers safely before. On paper, it was a machine built for reliability. On board were 257 passengers and 18 crew. 4 pilots shared the cockpit duties, and they were all seasoned. The captain, a 42-year-old Danish pilot, commanded the flight with 8,195 total flight hours, including 1,372 hours on the Airbus A340. The first officer, a Canadian pilot, had 8,316 flight hours with approximately 425 on the same aircraft type. The relief captain and first officer were also exceptionally experienced, with 12,486 and 6,438 hours, respectively. Between them was more than 35,000 flight hours. They had flown into storms, across continents, over oceans. They were seasoned, steady, and calm. Safety seemed to rest in numbers, but sometimes numbers lie. The cockpit was crowded that evening. 2 engineers hovered, printouts and paperwork shifting hands, laptops open, checklists read aloud. The A340 was built for long hauls, and the presence of an augmented crew was routine. But routine creates clutter. With too many voices and tasks overlapping, a simple safeguard was left undone. The captain didn't call out a verbal check of the first officer's work. It didn't seem like much at the time, a single missed line in a sea of procedures. After all, everything else looked ordinary. The airplane gleamed under the runway lights. The passengers were strapped in, expecting a long night but nothing more. The engines waited, quiet but powerful. Yet behind that calm lay the first fault line. In a system built on redundancy, one small gap had already opened. Nobody noticed, nobody could. The clock ticked closer to departure. The A340 pushed back, taxied, and rolled toward the runway. All appeared normal, but the ordinariness of the night was the very disguise that hid the stakes. Stakes that would soon come crashing forward in the form of a single mistyped number. Modern jets don't leave performance to instinct. Before every takeoff, the crew must calculate exactly how much thrust the engines should deliver and the speeds at which the aircraft can safely lift off. Too much thrust wastes fuel. Too little leaves the plane underpowered. These calculations are done using the electronic flight bag, an EFB. Think of it as a hardened laptop built into the cockpit, a digital replacement for thick manuals and charts. The EFB needs one key input above all: the aircraft's weight. That single figure dictates everything. That night, the Airbus A340 system showed a takeoff weight of 361.9 tons. The crew planned to round it up for safety to 362.9 tons, but when the first officer entered the figure, his finger slipped. Instead of typing 362.9, he typed 262.9 tons, one digit, 100 tons missing. The EFB didn't know it was wrong. It simply ran the math it was given. Based on the lower weight, it produced lower reference speeds and a reduced thrust setting. In effect, it told the crew, "This plane is lighter than it really is. You don't need as much power to take off." But the aircraft wasn't light. It was heavy, very heavy, fully fueled, fully loaded, carrying 275 people and cargo. Here's why it mattered. At 362.9 tons, the aircraft required a rotation speed around 163 knots. At 262.9 tons, the EFB calculated just 143 knots. That 20-knot gap meant the plane would try to lift too early at a speed where physics simply refused to cooperate. It's the aviation version of trying to jump while wearing a weighted vest. Your legs push, but the weight drags you down. Except here, the legs were 4 Rolls-Royce engines set deliberately below the thrust actually required. Checks existed to catch this, several in fact, but in the noise of a busy cockpit, in the comfort of experience, none of them worked. The weight of a number had already betrayed them. The runway was waiting, the engines soon to spool up, and with every second, the cost of that mistyped digit grew heavier. Aviation safety depends on redundancy. When one layer misses, another is meant to catch. On this night, 3 such layers stood between Emirates Flight 407 and disaster. All 3 failed. First, the captain's missed verbal check. Standard procedure calls for the pilot who enters numbers into the EFB to read them back while the captain confirms. The EFB, basically a toughened laptop, shows the takeoff weight, the flex temperature, and the speeds. In the white noise of the cockpit, with 2 engineers moving about and 4 pilots sharing space, the captain didn't catch the first officer's keystroke. He signed off on the figures without the out-loud confirmation that would have highlighted a 100-ton mismatch. It was a small shortcut, one that would later prove enormous. Second, the load sheet misstep. Ground operations provided a weight and balance sheet, the official load sheet that should have matched the EFB entry. During the final checks, the first officer corrected what he thought was a transcription error on the load sheet. He changed a digit in the paperwork, but that action removed a chance to compare the 2 independent sources. Instead of prompting a double take, his correction made the paperwork look consistent with the EFB. 2 wrongs, seemingly in sync. Third, the green dot discrepancy. The EFB's calculated green dot speed, a quick performance cue used for awareness, was 225 knots. The flight management system, the airplane's own brain, showed 265 knots. A 40-knot difference is not small. Yet when the first officer called out the numbers, the captain's attention latched onto one pattern. Both ended in 5. That tiny mental shortcut made the huge gap feel harmless. Human brains seek patterns. Under pressure, they sometimes see sameness where there is none. Stack them together: cockpit noise, a corrected load sheet, a cursory speed comparison, and the checks that should have stopped the error failed to do their job. Each missed step didn't feel like a catastrophe on its own. They were tiny, plausible omissions in a routine that had always worked before. What the crew didn't have was an order of magnitude alarm, a simple check to say, "This number is wildly different." The EFB gave values that seemed reasonable, and the pilots relied on experience to judge reasonableness. It's a subtle vulnerability. When automation looks plausible, human suspicion relaxes. By 2200 hours and 30 minutes, the A340 was cleared to line up. The engines spooled. The crew believed they were ready, but the safety web had already been frayed in ways nobody noticed. The runway waited. The first roll would reveal how badly those threads had failed. At 10:30 p.m., Flight 407 began its takeoff roll down runway 16. The A340's 4 Rolls-Royce engines rumbled to life, pushing nearly 400 tons of aircraft into motion. Outwardly, nothing looked wrong. In the cockpit, speed tapes climbed. In the cabin, passengers felt the familiar push of acceleration. But something was off. The aircraft was sluggish. Heavier than the math allowed, it clawed forward more slowly than expected. At night, with no visual reference to compare, the difference was nearly invisible. There was no cockpit warning system to shout, "You're not accelerating fast enough." Silence carried the illusion of normal. The runway stretched long, but not endless. Each second shaved away hundreds of meters of asphalt. At 1,000 meters consumed, the jet had not reached the speed it should have. At 2,000 meters, acceleration still lagged, yet the callouts followed the plan, guided by faulty numbers. Passengers might have felt nothing unusual, just a long roll, the cabin trembling as thrust pressed them back. But to the pilots, subtle cues were starting to emerge. The jet felt reluctant, heavy. Still, checklists said all was in order. As the runway markers flashed by, pressure mounted. The false rotation speed was fast approaching. In truth, the A340 needed far more energy to fly. On paper, it was ready. In reality, it was stuck to the earth. By now, only 1,000 meters of runway remained. The gap between calculated performance and actual physics had closed to a dangerous sliver. The night outside remained calm. Stars overhead, lights along the runway glowing steady. Nothing in the environment screamed alarm, but by the time they reached the point where the plane should have been airborne, it still clung to the ground. The runway was running out, fast. At about 1,043 meters before the runway end, the captain called "rotate." The ritual was calm and precise, a single command that should lift a heavy jet from asphalt to sky. The first officer pulled back on the side stick. The nose moved, but the airplane would not come off the ground. The captain repeated the command, sharper this time. Again, the first officer pulled. The nose wheel began to lighten, but the A340 refused to rise. It was still locked to the earth. Too slow, too heavy. The runway was vanishing, just 300 meters left. At this speed, braking was impossible. Stopping distance had already passed. The only option was to fly or crash through the fence at the end. In a split-second decision, the captain seized control. He pushed the thrust levers forward to their absolute limit. TOGA, takeoff OT go-around power. All four engines roared at maximum output, a surge of raw thrust tearing through the night. But the response came with a brutal cost. The tail struck the runway. Metal screamed against asphalt as the fuselage scraped along the ground. Sparks showered the darkness, a deep gouge tearing into the belly of the jet. The rear pressure bulkhead, a critical structural wall, absorbed the blow. For those on board, the sensation was jarring, an unnatural shudder, the tail dragging, vibration rattling the cabin. Some passengers thought they had already crashed. Yet the jet clawed forward, now at full power, barely lifting from the earth. The last runway lights blurred past. Grass rushed beneath the wheels, and then, finally, lift. The A340 dragged itself into the air, only meters clear of disaster. It crossed the boundary of the airport not with the smooth grace of flight, but with the scars of survival. The worst seemed narrowly avoided, but the story was not finished. Physics had granted a reprieve, not a rescue. Ahead lay antennas, fences, and the dark waters of Port Phillip Bay. Would the wounded jet clear the obstacles still in its path? The A340's climb was shallow, almost reluctant. Engines thundered at full power, straining against the weight they had been misled about. The aircraft's belly, torn open by the tail strike, left debris scattered across the runway. Behind, Melbourne Airport's emergency lights illuminated scars in the asphalt nearly 200 meters long, but the jet itself pressed forward, carrying its wounds into the night. Seconds after liftoff, it struck a strobe light. Metal and glass exploded into fragments. Another 100 meters, and the aircraft clipped the localizer antenna array, equipment that guides planes safely to the runway. In an instant, Melbourne's instrument landing system went dark. Still, the jet pressed on, skimming barely clear of the ground. The airport perimeter fence rose ahead. At just over 2 meters tall, it might as well have been a wall. Yet the A340 cleared it by the narrowest of margins. Witnesses on the ground later described the aircraft as skimming above the fence. impossibly low for a long-haul jet. For the crew, the climb was a battle of seconds. Every foot of altitude won meant one less obstacle. At last, the aircraft's nose lifted higher, gaining airspeed, climbing away from the city. Beneath, the lights of Melbourne fell away as the jet headed out over the black waters of Port Phillip Bay. In the cabin, tension rippled among passengers. Few knew the scale of the danger. They felt the violent scrape at takeoff, heard the engine straining harder than usual, but no announcement yet came. Most held tight to armrests, waiting for normalcy to return. In the cockpit, however, normalcy was gone. Warnings flashed, tail strike. ATC confirmed visible sparks on departure. The crew had no doubt the aircraft was damaged badly, and they now faced a decision: press on into the night with hidden damage, or turn back toward the same runway they had barely survived. Over the bay, the pilots steadied the climb. They needed altitude, time, and answers, and soon they would discover the root of the mistake that nearly ended them all. 5 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit was still alive with alarms. The tail strike warning blinked, confirmed by air traffic control. Sparks and debris had been seen as the jet left the ground. Damage was certain. The question was, how much? The crew stabilized at 7,000 feet. Over Port Phillip Bay, with the city lights fading behind them, the pilots began emergency checks. Systems were scanned, performance reviewed. The captain and first officer worked methodically, though tension hung on every call. Then came the moment of realization. As the first officer recalculated landing performance, he saw it. The weight entered into the electronic flight bag was 262.9 tons. The true number was 362.9. 100 tons missing. The mistake was undeniable. The cockpit absorbed the shock. This was no mechanical failure, no hidden defect. It was a simple keystroke, compounded by layers of human oversight. In aviation, weight determines everything: power, speeds, climb performance. For 5 minutes, 275 lives had ridden on faulty math. The error explained everything: the sluggish roll, the refusal to lift, the desperate tail strike, the brutal scrape that nearly tore the aircraft apart. It wasn't chance, it was physics catching up to human error. The crew pressed on. There was no undoing what had happened, only the urgent task of bringing the wounded jet back to the ground. They now faced a new dilemma. The aircraft was far too heavy to land safely. At liftoff, it weighed more than 360 tons. Maximum landing weight was just 280. To return, they would have to shed nearly 80 tons of fuel. The calculation was grim. They had survived takeoff by meters. Could they survive a return? The Airbus leveled at 7,000 feet, engines still straining at full power. The crew requested a holding pattern over Port Phillip Bay, circling above the dark water while they dumped fuel. Fuel jettison is not quick. Thousands of liters poured from the wingtips in shimmering streams, reducing weight minute by minute. The target was clear: bring the jet down from more than 360 tons to 280. Only then could the landing gear bear the impact without risk of collapse. Inside the cockpit, discipline returned. 3 separate calculations were run, 2 on the EFB, 1 from the Quick Reference Handbook. No more assumptions, no more shortcuts. Every number was checked, cross-checked, and read aloud. But just as order seemed restored, another ripple of fear hit. A cabin crew report came through. Passengers had seen smoke in the cabin. For a moment, the worst was imagined. Fire in a damaged fuselage. Investigation revealed a different source. Dust sucked into the cabin from the ruptured pressure seals, stirred loose by the tail strike. It wasn't fire, but it was a stark reminder the aircraft was hurt in ways they could not fully see. Below, emergency services prepared Melbourne Airport for the return. Fire crews lined the runway. Ambulances waited on standby. Controllers cleared airspace. On the ground, the scars of the takeoff still smoked. Antenna wrecked, runway torn, debris scattered. In the sky, the crew flew circles, fuel draining away, time dragging. Every pass above the bay was a reminder that their next move would decide everything. Finally, the weight dropped into limits. The A340 was light enough to attempt a landing. The captain briefed the crew. This would be no routine descent. It would be one of the most critical approaches of their lives. The turn back toward Melbourne had begun. An hour after their near disaster, the crew of Emirates Flight 407 turned back toward Melbourne. Fuel had been jettisoned, weight reduced to safe limits. The A340 lined up for runway 34, its engine steady, its crew tense. Every checklist had been run, every system had been reviewed, but no one in the cockpit knew the full extent of the damage beneath them. The tail strike had torn into the fuselage, shaved away structural panels, and crushed the rear pressure bulkhead. The landing would be a test of whether the wounded airframe could still take the stress. The approach was steady but fraught. Lights along the runway guided them in, but for the crew, the real markers were airspeed and descent rate. Too fast, and the damaged frame might fail. Too slow, and the aircraft could stall. In the cabin, passengers braced. Many still did not know the scale of what had happened. Some believed it was a normal return. Others, having seen sparks at takeoff or smelled dust and smoke, gripped their seats in silence. The moment came. Main gear struck the runway with a heavy thud. The nose followed, shuddering but controlled. The aircraft decelerated, reversers roaring, brakes straining. At last, the A340 slowed to a crawl, rolling to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles. Relief swept the cabin. No one had been injured. Against every margin, the flight had ended on its wheels, but the consequences did not stop at survival. The aircraft, registration A6ERG, was badly scarred. It would spend 9 months in repair before returning to service. The crew, though their split-second decisions had saved lives, were asked to resign upon return to Dubai. Their careers ended where the flight had not. For Melbourne, the near disaster left physical reminders: gouges in the runway, destroyed antennas, a scar on airport infrastructure. Investigators soon arrived, tasked with answering how a modern airliner, flown by experienced pilots, had come within 148 meters of catastrophe. Flight 407 had survived, but the investigation was just beginning. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau's investigation traced the cause to one simple truth: human error. A single mistyped digit, 262.9 instead of 362.9 tons, had cascaded through every safeguard. But the report did not stop at blame. It dug deeper, exposing systemic weaknesses that extended beyond one crew, one flight, or one airline. The findings revealed that pilots across the industry struggled with similar errors. In fact, more than 30 significant incidents worldwide had stemmed from weight entry mistakes. Surveys showed half of pilots had encountered performance data problems at some point in their careers. The vulnerability was not unique, it was systemic. The report emphasized human factors: cockpit busyness, distraction, confirmation bias, and the challenge of spotting errors when numbers still appear reasonable. It highlighted the automation paradox, that tools like the electronic flight bag reduce workload, but create new risks if their inputs are wrong. Safety recommendations rippled outward. Emirates introduced dual laptop checks for all flights, ensuring that performance data was entered twice and compared. Airbus began developing monitoring systems to track acceleration during takeoff, providing pilots with alerts when the aircraft failed to meet expected performance. Regulators urged airlines worldwide to adopt stricter validation procedures. The incident also left a personal legacy. For the captain and first officer, careers ended in the shadow of a mistake magnified by circumstance. For the passengers, it became a story of survival they might recount for a lifetime. And for aviation, Flight 407 became a case study, proof that even with layers of technology, procedures, and experience, the smallest oversight can still threaten disaster. 9 months after the incident, a 6 ERG returned to the skies, repaired and rebuilt repainted, but the lessons of that night endured long after its final flight in 2014. The legacy of Flight 407 is not just about near catastrophe. It is about the fragility of systems that rely on human input and the resilience of crews forced to act when those systems fail. In aviation, numbers carry weight, literally, and on that night in Melbourne, the difference between 262 and 362 nearly became the measure of life and death. Emirates Flight 407 never made headlines as a disaster, but in the quiet margins of aviation history, it sits as one of the closest calls Australia ever faced. A single digit almost rewrote hundreds of lives and changed how the industry safeguards every departure today. Thank you for watching this story. If you'd like to see more aviation documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you found this video informative. See you in the next one.